In 1974, a Japanese soldier walked out of the Philippine jungle carrying a rifle and wearing a faded military uniform. The shocking part was that World War II had ended nearly 29 years earlier, but he still believed the war was ongoing. For decades, he survived alone in the jungle, hiding from civilians, rejecting surrender leaflets, and following an order he refused to break. While the world moved on, one soldier remained trapped in a war that officially ended in 1945. To understand why Hiroo Onoda refused to stop fighting, you first need to understand what kind of man he was, and what kind of machine had made him. Because Onoda was not ordinary. He was not a simple foot soldier following simple orders. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man who had been deliberately, carefully, scientifically engineered to never give up. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kamekawa, Wakayama, in the Empire of Japan. He grew up in a country that was rapidly transforming itself into a military superpower. The Japan of Onoda's childhood was not a peaceful democracy. It was a nation intoxicated by imperial ambition, by the idea of destiny, by the absolute sacred duty of loyalty to the emperor above all else. These were not just political ideas. They were the air Onoda breathed from the day he was born. He grew up in a society that specifically valued military service and loyalty to the emperor. By the time he was a teenager, war was not an abstract concept. It was the highest calling a Japanese man could answer. In 1939, he went to work at a branch of the Taijima Yoko Trading Company in Wuhan, China. He was just 17, and in Wuhan, he saw the reality of Japanese imperial expansion up close. The occupied streets, the soldiers, the absolute power of the army. It did not horrify him. It shaped him. In 1942, he was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was 20 years old, and almost immediately, the army recognized that Hiroo Onoda was not like the other recruits. Most Japanese soldiers who were conscripted in 1942 went through standard basic training and were assigned to infantry units. They learned to march, shoot, and follow orders. They were pieces on a military chessboard, moved by commanders who decided their fate. Onoda was not sent to basic training. He was sent somewhere else entirely. He was sent to the Futamata branch of the Nakano Military School, a training facility in Tokyo that specialized in turning out elite commando units. The Nakano School was one of the most secretive institutions in the entire Japanese military. Most people had never heard of it. Those who attended it were sworn to absolute secrecy, and what happened inside its walls was unlike anything in the conventional military. As a student, Onoda studied guerrilla warfare, philosophy, history, martial arts, propaganda, and covert operations. Not just how to fight, how to think, how to survive alone, how to operate for months or years without support, how to distinguish enemy propaganda from real information, how to maintain mental discipline under conditions that would break ordinary men. Notably, his training defied the widely distributed Shinjinkan battlefield code that forbade combatants from being taken prisoner and instructed them to die fighting or via self-sacrifice instead. The Nakano School taught something different, something more dangerous. It taught its graduates to stay alive at all costs, because a living soldier who keeps fighting is worth more than a dead hero. It taught them that capture was not an option, but neither was death. What was required was endurance, permanent, unbreakable endurance. His Nakano School training emphasized self-sufficiency, skepticism toward enemy deceptions, and perpetual resistance. Every lesson Onoda received was designed to make him doubt anything that told him the war was over. Every lecture was engineered to make him resistant to the enemy's attempts to deceive him into surrendering. The Nakano School was not just teaching soldiers. It was building human weapons that could not be switched off. That training would be the key to everything that followed. On December 26, 1944, Onoda was sent to lead guerrilla warfare operations on Lubang Island in the Japanese-occupied Philippines. He was 22 years old. Lubang was a small island about 93 miles southwest of Manila, strategically important, and about to become the center of the Allied push to retake the Philippines. His mission required him to carry out sabotage operations against Allied forces. He had to destroy airfields, sink supply ships, and harass the enemy through the use of guerrilla tactics. It was exactly the kind of mission the Nakano School had trained him for. Independent, dangerous, operating alone in hostile territory without support. And then his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him the orders that would define the rest of his life. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi promised the young lieutenant on February 28, 1945. Come back for you. Those 4 words. A promise from a superior officer to a 22-year-old man standing on the edge of a jungle at the beginning of what he believed would be his greatest test. His orders explicitly stated that under no circumstances was he to surrender or take his own life. Never surrender. Never die by your own hand. Fight. Wait. Endure. We will come back. Onoda nodded, picked up his rifle, and walked into the jungle. He would not walk out for 29 years. Within months, the situation on Lubang had deteriorated completely. After a short period, all but Second Lieutenant Onoda and 3 other soldiers had died or surrendered. Onoda led the 3 men into the island's mountains. For men, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Hiroo Onoda, their commanding officer, their leader, the man who carried Taniguchi's promise in his chest like a coal that never went cold. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The war ended. The first time Onoda's group saw a leaflet announcing that Japan had surrendered was in October 1945. The men concluded that the leaflet was Allied propaganda and reasoned that they would not have been fired on before if the war had ended. The Nakano School had taught Onoda to be skeptical of exactly this kind of message. The enemy would try to deceive you. The enemy would drop leaflets. The enemy would tell you the war was over. It was a trick. It was always a trick. His training told him so. His orders told him so. And Major Taniguchi had promised to come back. So Onoda waited, and fought, and endured, as the rest of the world moved on. Rebuilt. Forgot. Hiroo Onoda stayed exactly where his commander had left him. In the jungle. At war. Waiting for a promise to be kept. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito speaks on the radio. His voice, the voice of a god, according to Japanese tradition, tells the Japanese people that the war is over. Japan has surrendered. The fighting must stop. Across the Pacific, millions of soldiers laid down their weapons. In cities and jungles and on islands scattered across the ocean, men who had been willing to die for their emperor simply stopped. The war was over. Everyone knew it. Everyone heard it. Everyone except 4 men on a small island in the Philippines. For men who had no radio. For men who were too deep in the jungle to hear anything except the sound of the forest around them. And even if they had heard, Hiroo Onoda would not have believed it. Because here is the thing that most people don't understand about Onoda's story. He was not stupid. He was not insane. He was not delusional in any clinical sense. He was a highly intelligent, highly trained, highly disciplined soldier, whose entire education had been specifically designed to make him reject exactly this kind of news. The Nakano School had taught him one thing above all others. The enemy will lie to you. The enemy will tell you the war is over. The enemy will show you documents. The enemy will drop leaflets. The enemy will use every psychological trick available to make you believe that resistance is futile, that surrender is reasonable, that laying down your weapons is the rational thing to do. And every single one of those things is a deception. Every single one is designed to defeat you without firing a shot. So when the leaflets came, Onoda read them. He studied them carefully. He looked for errors, and he found them, or thought he did. Dates that seemed wrong, phrasing that seemed off, details that didn't match what he knew. And he concluded, as the Nakano school had trained him to conclude, that they were forgeries. Enemy propaganda. Exactly what he had been warned about. The first leaflet announcing Japan's surrender arrived in October 1945. Onoda dismissed it. More leaflets followed. Onoda dismissed them all. In 1952, the Japanese government tried something different. They sent personal letters and photographs to the holdouts on Lubang. Letters from family members, photographs of loved ones, pleas from parents and siblings begging their sons and brothers to come home. The war is over. Please come home. Onoda read those letters. He looked at those photographs. He recognized the faces. And then he made the most agonizing decision a human being can make. He decided they were fake. That the enemy had somehow obtained photographs of his family and forged letters in their handwriting to trick him into surrendering. He folded the letters. He put them away, and he stayed in the jungle. Think about what that means for a moment. A man so thoroughly conditioned, so completely committed, that he could look at what appeared to be a letter from his own mother and decide it was an enemy forgery. That is not madness. That is the most complete and terrifying success of military indoctrination in the history of warfare. And while Onoda refused to believe the war was over, the war, his war, continued. The four men, Onoda, Akatsu, Shimada, and Kozuka, had settled into a brutal rhythm of survival. They moved constantly through the jungle, never staying in one place long enough to be found. They slept in makeshift shelters, crude lean-tos built from branches and leaves that they dismantled before moving on. They ate bananas, coconuts, whatever the jungle provided. And when the jungle didn't provide enough, they raided local farms, stealing rice, taking food from the very people whose island they were on. People who had done nothing wrong. People who were simply trying to live their lives on their own land. The raids brought them into conflict with local farmers and police. Shots were fired. People were killed. Over the years of Onoda's jungle war, an estimated 30 civilian islanders died in encounters with his group. 30 people who had survived the Second World War, who had watched the Japanese occupation end, who believed they were finally at peace. Killed by soldiers fighting a war that had ended before most of those victims had learned to walk. Onoda did not think of them as innocent civilians. He thought of them as enemy collaborators, extensions of the Allied forces he had been sent here to fight. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was the logical outcome of a man who had been told the war never ended, following the rules of engagement he had been given, in a war that existed only in his own mind. The first crack in the group came in 1949. Private Yuichi Akatsu simply walked away. He had had enough. After 4 years in the jungle, for years of watching for a rescue that never came, for years of eating bananas and sleeping in the dirt and shooting at farmers, Akatsu decided that the war was probably over after all. He separated from the group quietly in September 1949. He surrendered to Philippine forces in March 1950. Onoda never forgave him. He and the remaining 2 men, Shimada and Kozuka, considered Akatsu's surrender a desertion, a betrayal, and it made them more suspicious, more careful, more isolated. If Akatsu had been weak enough to surrender, then they would be strong enough to resist. They would not make the same mistake. But the jungle was taking its toll. In June 1953, Corporal Shimada was wounded in the leg in a shootout with local fishermen. For months, Onoda nursed him back to health. Improvised medicine, improvised bandages, the kind of desperate care that only soldiers who have no one else can give each other. Shimada recovered. For a time. Then on May 7, 1954, Shimada was killed. shot in a confrontation with a Philippine army unit that accidentally encountered the holdouts while training on the island. One moment he was there. The next, he was gone. 9 years in the jungle. And it ended in a random encounter with soldiers who weren't even looking for him. Now there were two, Onoda and Kozuka. Two men against a world that had forgotten them. Two men fighting a war that everyone else had moved on from. Two men eating coconuts in a jungle while Japan rebuilt itself into an economic miracle. While the Beatles played on radio stations across the world. While men walked on the moon. They didn't know about any of it. They didn't know Japan had become a democracy. They didn't know there were color televisions and highways and skyscrapers in Tokyo. They didn't know that the world they had left in 1944 no longer existed in any meaningful sense. They just knew the jungle, and the mission, and the promise that someone would come back for them. For 18 years, Onoda and Kozuka fought together. 18 years. That is longer than most wars. Longer than most friendships. Longer than most of the viewers watching this video have been alive. Two men alone in a jungle for 18 years. Sharing everything. Depending on each other for survival. Keeping each other's sanity alive through the sheer force of shared purpose. And then on October 19th, 1972, it ended. Kozuka was killed in a shootout with local police. He and Onoda had been conducting one of their recurring raids, burning piles of rice harvested by villagers. A signal they believed would tell other Japanese forces that they were still alive and still fighting. Local police responded. Shots were exchanged. And Kinshichi Kozuka, who had survived 27 years in the Philippine jungle, died on a muddy path between rice paddies. Onoda was alone. Completely. Utterly. Finally alone. For the first time in nearly 30 years. There was no one to talk to. No one to share watch with. No one to eat with. No one to confirm for him that what he was doing was right. Just the jungle. And the mission. And a promise that Taniguchi had made in 1945 that was now 27 years old. And still Onoda waited. He had been officially declared dead in 1959. His family in Japan had mourned him. His country had moved on. The war he was fighting existed in the minds of exactly one person on Earth. But Hiroo Onoda, as he had always done, followed his orders. He endured. He persisted. He waited for a promise to be kept. The years passed. The jungle grew. The world changed beyond all recognition. And on a small island in the Philippines, a 52-year-old man in a tattered Imperial Japanese uniform cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and waited for morning. He would wait 2 more years before anyone came. February 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. A young man steps off a boat and looks at the jungle. He is 24 years old. His name is Norio Suzuki, and he is possibly the most unusual person to ever set foot on this island. Suzuki is a traveler, an adventurer, a free spirit in the fullest sense of the word. The kind of young Japanese man who in the early 1970s had decided that the world was too interesting to stay in one place. He had been wandering for years, through Asia, through Europe, through places most people only read about in books. And he had told his friends, before leaving on this particular journey, exactly what he was looking for. Lieutenant Onoda, he said, a panda, and the abominable snowman. In that order. He was not entirely joking. By 1974, the story of Hiroo Onoda had become something between a legend and an embarrassment in Japan. Everyone knew the basic facts. A Japanese soldier, still fighting in the Philippines. Still believing the war was happening. The Japanese government had tried to contact him. Had failed. Search parties had been sent. Had failed. Official communications had been attempted. Had failed. The man simply would not come out. Most people had concluded, quietly, that Hiroo Onoda was either dead or completely beyond reach. A ghost story. A relic of a war that the rest of the world had spent 30 years trying to forget. Norio Suzuki did not see it that way. Suzuki believed something that the official search parties, with all their resources and protocols, had missed. He believed that what Onoda needed was not an official communication, not a government document, not another leaflet from the sky. What Onoda needed was a human being, someone who would come to him not as an authority figure, not as an enemy, not as a representative of a world he had rejected, but simply as another person, someone who would sit down across from him in the jungle and listen. So Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island with almost nothing. No official credentials, no government backing, no military escort, just himself, a backpack, and an extraordinary belief that the most wanted missing person in Japanese history could be found by a 24-year-old with enough patience to look. He searched for 4 days. For days. While the Japanese government had spent years and enormous resources failing to locate Onoda, Norio Suzuki found him in 4 days. The exact circumstances of their first meeting have a quality that is almost cinematic in its strangeness. Onoda emerged from the jungle and found himself facing not a soldier, not an official, but a young Japanese man in civilian clothes who looked very much like what the 1970s produced. Long hair, casual manner, the kind of person that Onoda's rigid military world would have categorized immediately as a hippie. Onoda later described the moment in an interview with characteristic precision. This hippie boy Suzuki came to the island to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier. There is something in that sentence worth sitting with. Not to capture him, not to trick him, not to deliver orders. To listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier. As if in 30 years of hiding, no one had simply asked Onoda how he felt about any of it. Onoda raised his rifle when Suzuki approached. Of course he did. A stranger appearing in his jungle was, by definition, a potential enemy. But Suzuki did not run. He stood his ground. He introduced himself. He spoke quietly. He explained who he was and why he had come. And something happened that all the official communications and government documents and dropped leaflets had never managed to achieve. Onoda listened. The two men talked for hours, then days. They ate together. They slept in the same jungle that Onoda had called home for 3 decades. And a strange and genuine friendship began to form between them, between a 52-year-old soldier who had been at war since 1944 and a 24-year-old adventurer who had been born after the war ended. Suzuki asked Onoda questions that no one had ever thought to ask. Not tactical questions, not official questions, personal questions. What was it like? What did you think about? What kept you going? And Onoda answered, perhaps for the first time in 30 years. He talked about it. But when Suzuki eventually asked the question that everyone wanted answered, would Onoda come out of the jungle? Would he surrender? Onoda's answer was immediate and absolute. No, not because he didn't trust Suzuki. Not because he still fully believed the war was raging, but because of something deeper than belief. Something that the Nakano school had put inside him so thoroughly that it had become the foundation of his identity. He had been given orders by his commanding officer. Those orders had never been rescinded. Until Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, and only Major Taniguchi, stood before him and officially relieved him of duty. Hiroo Onoda would remain at his post. That was not a choice. That was who he was. I will wait, he told Suzuki. Bring my commanding officer. Suzuki left the island carrying something that no one had managed to bring back before. Photographs. Real, undeniable, contemporary photographs of Hiroo Onoda, alive, in uniform, rifle in hand, in the Philippine jungle. February 1974. The photographs caused a sensation in Japan. The ghost was real. The last soldier was alive. And he had made a specific demand that the Japanese government now had no choice but to fulfill. Find Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The problem was that Major Taniguchi was no longer Major Taniguchi in any meaningful sense. The war had ended 30 years ago. The Imperial Japanese Army had ceased to exist. The man who had sent Onoda into the jungle in 1944 with a promise to come back, had come back from the war himself, rebuilt his life, and was now living quietly in Japan as something that could not have been further from a military officer. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi was a bookseller. He ran a bookshop. He sold books. He had a civilian life, a civilian identity, a civilian existence that was about as far removed from the jungles of the Philippines as it was possible to get. He had served his country. The war had ended. He had moved on. And now the Japanese government was knocking on the door of his bookshop to tell him that one of the men he had sent into the jungle in 1944 was still there, still waiting, still following the orders that Taniguchi himself had given, still believing in the promise that Taniguchi had made. We will come back for you. It had taken 30 years. But Taniguchi was going to keep that promise. He agreed immediately. Without hesitation. He would go to Lubang Island. He would find Hiroo Onoda. And he would do what he should have done. What circumstance and secrecy and the chaos of war's end had prevented him from doing. 30 years ago, he would relieve his soldier of duty. Suzuki returned to Lubang with Taniguchi. They made their way into the jungle, and somewhere on a Philippine mountainside, in the same jungle where Hiroo Onoda had spent 29 years keeping faith with a promise. The two men found each other again. Onoda saw Taniguchi approaching. He recognized him. After 30 years, he recognized him. And in that moment of recognition, something that had been held tightly for 3 decades began, finally, to loosen. Taniguchi stood before his soldier, and he read the official orders. In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command, the Special Squadron is relieved of all military duties. Units and individuals under the command of the Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately. The war, Hiroo Onoda's war, was over. Onoda stood very still for a long moment. He looked at his commanding officer. He looked at the orders. He looked at the jungle around him, the jungle that had been his entire world for 29 years. And then, for the first time since December 1944, Hiroo Onoda wept. March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippine jungle. 2 men walk toward each other through the trees. One of them is 52 years old. He is wearing a uniform that was issued to him in 1945. It is torn and faded and repaired so many times that there is barely any original fabric left. He is carrying a rifle that still works. His pack contains ammunition and supplies he has maintained with obsessive care for 29 years. His face is weathered and hollow. His eyes are clear. The other man is older now, much older than the last time they met. He is no longer a major. He is no longer a soldier. He is a bookseller from Japan who has been asked to do one final thing in service of his country. Keep a promise he made 30 years ago. Yoshimi Taniguchi stops walking. He looks at the man in front of him. The man who followed his orders so completely, so faithfully, so absolutely, that he had kept fighting for 3 decades after everyone else had stopped. And then Taniguchi reads the orders. In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command, the Special Squadron is relieved of all military duties. Units and individuals under the command of the Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When no officer is present, they are to follow the directives of the Philippine government and U.S. Armed Forces. Silence. The jungle around them makes its endless noise. Birds, insects, wind in the leaves. The sounds that had been Onoda's entire world for 29 years. And then Hiroo Onoda, for the first time since December 1944, wept. He later described what happened inside him when Taniguchi read those words. He said that everything he had lived for, Everything that had kept him going through 29 years of jungle and loss and loneliness simply collapsed. Not with relief, not with joy, with something far more complicated than either of those things. Suddenly, everything went black, he said. A 30-year weight was lifted from my shoulders. He stood in the jungle with tears running down his face. The rifle in his hands, the uniform on his body, the identity of a soldier he had worn so long it had become the only identity he had. And all of it was over. On March 9, 1974, Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle for the last time. He was carrying his rifle, his ammunition, his dagger, and the sword that had been given to him when he was commissioned as an officer. He carried them not as weapons, but as the last physical evidence of everything he had been. He was taken to meet Ferdinand Marcos, the president of the Philippines. The ceremony that followed was one of the strangest in modern military history. A Japanese soldier, in a tattered Imperial Army uniform, surrendering to the president of a country he had spent 29 years treating as enemy territory. Formally, officially, with all the dignity he could still command, Onoda presented his sword to President Marcos. It was the traditional gesture of a defeated officer acknowledging the end of hostilities. He had refused to make this gesture for 29 years. Now he made it, with tears still on his face, standing at attention, in the uniform of an army that no longer existed. Marcos, to his considerable credit, did not treat Onoda as a criminal. He accepted the surrender with the respect it deserved. And then he did something unexpected. He pardoned Onoda immediately for all acts committed during his 30 years in the Philippine jungle, including the deaths of those 30 civilians who had lost their lives in encounters with Onoda and his group. The pardon was not universally welcomed. The families of those 30 people had waited years for justice, for an acknowledgement that their losses meant something, for someone to be held responsible. The Philippine government's decision to pardon Onoda caused deep pain in communities that had lived in the shadow of the jungle soldier for 3 decades. Onoda himself, in his later writings, expressed genuine remorse for the civilians who had died. He did not try to minimize what had happened. He did not excuse it. He explained it as the logical outcome of a man who had been trained to see everyone on that island as a potential enemy. But he did not excuse it. There is a difference. On March 12, 1974, Hiroo Onoda boarded a plane for Japan. He was wearing his imperial uniform, the same uniform he had worn into the jungle in 1944, the same uniform that had been repaired and maintained through 30 years of tropical weather. He had refused offers of civilian clothing. He was a soldier. He would return home as a soldier. The plane landed in Tokyo, and outside the airport, waiting for him, was Japan. 8,000 people, a crowd of 8,000 Japanese citizens who had turned out to welcome home the man who had become, in the weeks since Suzuki's photographs had been published, something between a celebrity, a relic, and a national symbol. There were flowers. There were cameras. There were officials and politicians and journalists from around the world who had flown in to witness this extraordinary moment. And in the middle of it all, a 52-year-old man in a tattered uniform who had last seen Tokyo in 1944 walked through the airport and into a world he did not recognize. The Japan he had left in 1944 was a nation at war, bombed, desperate, hungry, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The Japan he returned to in 1974 was one of the most prosperous nations on Earth. New cars, television sets, highways, department stores filled with things he had never seen before. A country that had been rebuilt from the ground up in the 30 years he had been away. He stood in the middle of it, surrounded by 8,000 people cheering his name, and later said that it felt completely unreal, as if he had stepped not just out of a jungle, but out of time itself, as if the world had continued without him, which it had, and he was now expected to step back into a story that had moved 30 years beyond where he had left it. He was a hero, Japan celebrated him as a hero. And he was. There is no question that what Hiroo Onoda did, the endurance, the discipline, the sheer refusal to break, represented something genuinely extraordinary in the history of human persistence. But he was also a man who had spent 30 years fighting a war that did not exist, who had killed people who were not his enemies, who had rejected the pleas of his own family for 3 decades, who had come home to find that everything he had known was gone. He was a hero, and he was a ghost, and standing in Tokyo airport with 8,000 people cheering around him. Hiroo Onoda was not entirely sure which one he was. Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974 as a national hero. Thousands of people gathered to welcome him. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted his name. He was given a hero's reception fit for a legend. But Onoda was not happy. The Japan he had left in 1944 no longer existed. The country he had sacrificed 29 years for, the country he had killed for, suffered for, and nearly died for, had completely transformed. The Japan of his memory was a nation of warriors, a land of honor, discipline, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. But the Japan he returned to was different. It was modern, wealthy, obsessed with money, fashion, television, and material possessions. The young people no longer spoke of duty or sacrifice. They spoke of cars, brands, and entertainment. Onoda felt like a ghost walking through a foreign land. The values he had held sacred for his entire life seemed to have vanished. He had given everything for a Japan that, in his eyes, no longer existed. He felt lost, disillusioned, out of place in the very country he had fought so hard to protect. So Onoda made a surprising decision. He left Japan. In 1975, just 1 year after his return, Hiroo Onoda moved to Brazil. He settled in a Japanese immigrant community in São Paulo and did something nobody expected from the legendary soldier. He became a cattle rancher. The man who had spent 29 years hiding in a jungle now spent his days riding across open fields, herding cattle under the wide Brazilian sky. It was a quiet life, a peaceful life, a life far away from the cameras, the fame, and the modern Japan that had broken his heart. In Brazil, Onoda finally found a kind of peace. He married a Japanese woman named Machi Anaku. He built a successful ranch. And for the first time in decades, he lived not as a soldier, but as an ordinary man. But Onoda was not finished with the world just yet. In 1984, after years in Brazil, Onoda returned to Japan, not to stay, but with a new purpose. He had watched the youth of Japan grow soft, in his opinion. He worried that young people had lost their connection to nature, to discipline, to survival, to resilience. So he founded the Onoda Nature School. It was a survival training camp for children and young people. At this school, Onoda taught the next generation the skills he had learned during his decades in the jungle: how to survive in the wild, how to stay calm under pressure, how to be self-reliant, and how to never, ever give up. The man who had once fought a phantom war now dedicated his life to teaching children how to be strong. In a strange way, his 29 years in the jungle had become a gift, a lesson he could pass on to others. For the rest of his life, Onoda split his time between Brazil and Japan, raising cattle and shaping young minds. But here is something most people don't know. Hiroo Onoda was not the last Japanese soldier to surrender from World War II. Just months after Onoda walked out of the jungle, another holdout was discovered. His name was Teruo Nakamura. Nakamura was a Taiwanese-born soldier who had served in the Imperial Japanese Army. Like Onoda, he had been hiding in the jungle, but on a different island, in Indonesia. Nakamura had been living completely alone, growing his own crops, surviving in total isolation for nearly 30 years. He was finally found and surrendered in December 1974, making him, not Onoda, the very last Japanese holdout of World War II. 2 men, 2 jungles, Two impossible stories of soldiers who refused to accept that their war was over. They were the final echoes of a conflict that had ended decades before. Hiroo Onoda lived a long life. He spent his final decades as a rancher, a teacher, and a living piece of history. He wrote a best-selling memoir about his experience, titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. And on January 16, 2014, Hiroo Onoda passed away in Tokyo. He was 91 years old. The last soldier of his war was finally at rest. So now we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. Was Hiroo Onoda a hero or a victim? On one hand, his story is the ultimate example of loyalty, discipline, and devotion. He kept a promise for 29 years. He survived conditions that would have broken almost any human being. He never gave up. But on the other hand, his story is a tragedy. He spent the best years of his life fighting a war that had already ended. He killed innocent people who were never his enemies. He missed his entire youth, his family, and a normal life, all for orders that had stopped mattering decades ago. Maybe Hiroo Onoda was both, a hero and a victim, a symbol of the very best and the very worst of what blind loyalty can do. His story forces us to ask ourselves a difficult question. How do we know when our beliefs are worth holding on to, and when they're just a jungle we refuse to leave? Think about that.